We might as well just finish the Prosecco, eh,
yeah.
Matt?
Well, I'm off to crack open another bottle. Mariella is here from 1 until 4. Thank you so much today. Thank you for all of your messages. They are all really nice, which is why I can't read them all out, because it would be self-indulgent nonsense. I'll be back tomorrow, of course, on Friday. We'll have all the usual stuff, by which time, hopefully, I'll have sobered up a bit. Mariella Frostop is up next. Don't go anywhere. Thank you so much to producer Lewis, Andrew Wright, Aina Warren, pushing the buttons. Well done to Jonathan. I'll see you tomorrow. Mariella's next. Bye-bye!
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
3 hours of live radio fueled by Prosecco. It's 1 o'clock. I'm Mariella Frostrup. This is Times Radio. Let's get the news from David Spencer.
Mariella, thank you. Good afternoon. The mother of 2 sisters murdered in a London park says justice has been done for her beautiful girls. Daniel Hussein has been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years for killing Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman in June last year. The 19-year-old repeatedly stabbed them in a supposed sacrifice that he believed would lead to him winning the lottery. Mina Smallman has paid tribute to her daughters outside the Old Bailey.
They were real people with hearts. Bieber has left behind a daughter who has given birth to a son in the last year, be coming up for a year. And I'm a great-grandmother. And I only met him because of COVID. I only met him for the first time at the celebration of life. So life is going on. There is a legacy.
The Civil Aviation Authority has welcomed a guilty verdict in the trial of a man over the plane crash that killed a pilot and Premier League footballer Emiliano Sala. He was completing a move to Cardiff City and flying to Wales when the plane came down in the English Channel. He died alongside David Ibbotson, with the businessman who organised the flight today being found guilty of endangering the safety of the aircraft. 67-year-old David Henderson from the East Riding of Yorkshire will be sentenced next month. He faces a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. The government has threatened to retaliate should France impose sanctions on British fishing vessels as a fresh dispute over fishing access escalates. Environment Secretary George Eustace said threats to block British boats from French ports and tighten checks appear to breach international law. He's been answering an emergency question in the Commons over apparent concerns raised in Paris.
The Honourable Lady says that France has claimed it's been too slow. That's not true. Indeed, the vast majority of those 1,700 or so vessels that we have already licensed received their licence on the 31st of December.
On Wednesday, 2 boats were fined by the French when one failed to comply with checks by police and the other was found not to hold a proper licence. Downing Street says Wednesday's budget showed the agility, flexibility and freedom that Brexit has afforded the government. The Office for Budget Responsibility says the impact of Brexit on the UK economy will be worse than that caused by the pandemic. Meanwhile, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has revealed its analysis and says if the Chancellor is to achieve his ambition to reduce taxes by the next election, he'll need to find radical solutions. IFS Director Paul Johnson thinks there are some tough times to come for many people.
Over the next several years, a combination of tax increases and high inflation will mean very slow growth in living standards. A middle earner is likely to be worse off next year than this, as high rates of inflation and tax rises more than negate small average wage increases.
The head of the army says he's appalled by claims British soldiers were involved in the killing of a Kenyan woman 9 years ago. The Ministry of Defence says it's cooperating with a Kenyan inquiry into the death of Agnes Wanjiru after the Sunday Times reported a soldier accused of the murder has been named by his colleagues and allegedly confessed to the killing. The body of the 21-year-old was found in a septic tank at a hotel in the town of Nanyuki, which is close to the British Army training base in Kenya. COP26 is the chance to win a victory for the next century for life on this planet, according to US climate envoy John Kerry. Speaking at the London School of Economics today, he warned all major countries must take action on climate change. The UN Climate Summit begins on Sunday, although the leaders of Russia and China won't be there. The French bulldog, which belonged to Sir David Amess, has been named Westminster Dog of the Year. Vivian had been entered into the competition by Sir David before he was fatally stabbed earlier this month. The Prime Minister has congratulated the animal on Twitter, and the dog was presented with a trophy outside the Houses of Parliament. Rain continuing for much of the UK, northern England, southern Scotland, more of Wales and then southwest England today. Brighter with showers in the northwest while staying mild and dry in the southeast. The top sports stories this hour. The South African cricketer Quinton de Kock has issued an emotional statement apologising for refusing to take the knee before their game with the West Indies this week. And England World Cup winner Fran Wilson has retired from international cricket. We'll have more sport for you at past.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker.
Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio with Charlie Biggums. Prepared in Charlie's kitchen, cooked in yours. Find Charlie Biggums in your local supermarket.
There you go. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the show. Thank you for listening. All 637,000 of you. Hurry up and get on the programme, the rest of you stragglers. We don't like to dwell on the past. It's onwards and upwards on this show. But as a special thank you for listening, for one day only, you can tell me what you like and don't like about the programme, but only if you don't contact me anonymously. It's first name terms only on this programme. So, any advice on what we can do better or compliments on what we do well already? Very welcome. Gratefully received either for today's 3-hour celebratory window. Text 87222, start your message with the word Times, tweet at Times Radio or email Bessie, my producer, studio@times.radio. In a few moments, we'll be taking a dive into the day's news, talking to the Olympian sailor and supporter of Extinction Rebellion, who's chained herself to the railings of a Hampshire oil refinery, investigating how middle-income families will be the worst hit by yesterday's budget, and why French fishermen are up in arms again. Does the thought of revisiting old diaries fill you with fear and trepidation? I always think that those who have time to write a diary aren't actually living life, but that certainly can't be true of my 2 p.m. guest today, who's been living life to the maximum for at least the last 70 years. Well, if you don't remember that music, you're just of the wrong generation. I can barely believe I'll be talking to the real Alexis Carrington as the waspous and delectable and brilliant Dame Joan Collins joins me at 2 p.m. She's been keeping a sporadic diary for 3 decades, and we are the lucky recipients of the pearl with the pearls within, as she's collated these candid and often humorous memories in a new memoir called My Unapologetic Diaries. She'll be telling me all about that at 2 p.m. But aside from the inimitable Joan Collins, who else's diary would you most like to read? I'd be up for a quick scan of Orlando Bloom's, perhaps. Woke up, drank a green machine, juice, did naked yoga, and then spent 3 hours admiring my reflection in the mirror and pondering my great contribution to feminism. That's made up, obviously, but I imagine it would go something like that. Anyway, whose diary would you really like to read? Text 87222, start your message with the word Times. Tweet at Times Radio or email Bessie, studio@times.radio. And that is the way to get in touch with us to tell us what you like and don't like or would like to see improved on our humble little show that's being listened to by 637,000 of you, which we're very excited about, having got the radars yesterday. Also coming up later, travel expert Ben Clatworthy will help us break down the government's decision to cut domestic air passenger duty days before COP26, and some travel inspiration, of course, for Christmas holidays, though. And we'll be previewing the latest films, including The Rescue, which chronicles the extraordinary effort to save a group of 12 children trapped in a rapidly flooding cave in Thailand. That and the latest news, views and interviews in our regular feature on the ground, where we speak to reporters across the globe about what's happening on their patch. We're getting the lowdown on how global warming is impacting South America as we continue our roundup, taking the temperature as we touch down across the globe in advance of our own trip to COP26. And in Life and Times, we celebrate a past interview of mine, and with that question, one of my absolute favourites, the Centurion Holocaust survivor Eddie Jaku, who told me that what he'd learned in his long life was that friendship is our most valuable commodity. Hear to that. And speaking of cordial relations, let's turn to distinctly discordant ones. The escalating row between France and Britain over post-Brexit fishing rights. French authorities have detained a British trawler and fined another, as the first boat did not comply and the second did not have a licence to fish. Sorry, just reminds me of Peter Sellers. They didn't have a license to fish in French waters, according to French Maritime Minister Annick Girardin. This comes as France has threatened to ban all British seafood imports from next week in retaliation to the UK's decision to not grant more fishing licences to French trawlers. Joining me now to tell us more is the Europe editor at France 24 English, Catherine Nicholson. Catherine, sorry about all the licence references, but Matt Chorley has me on the Prosecco early in the morning to celebrate our listening figures, so it's going to be a hair-raising pronunciation.
Enjoying it.
It's going to be a hair-raising ride today, that's all I can say. But not nearly as hair-raising as being a British trawlerman at the moment, I dare say. Catherine, what is the latest on this? What are the French authorities accusing the British of?
Absolutely. Like you just said in your summary, there was one vessel that got a warning because it didn't comply with the maritime gendarme, the sea police, when they asked it to stop because this was within French. That vessel did eventually comply, but because it hadn't warning. The second one was seized because
I think we're having really bad problems with your line, Catherine. Can we possibly get back to you, because that's just cutting out way too often. In the meantime, I'm going to entice listeners with what's coming up later on Times Radio today on our special celebratory day. John Pienaar's going to be back with Drive from 4 right through until 7. He'll have all the usual expert analysis of the day's news, and because it's a Thursday, he's also going to have the World Watch puzzle teaser for you to solve. Kate Borsay is sitting in for Phil Williams. She'll be on from 7 till 10, and Carol Walker will be back on air with her show at 10 p.m. And while we try to get Catherine back on a better line, let's move on. It was a buoyant Rishi Sunak delivering the budget yesterday afternoon, saying he was focused on the post-COVID era and would pave the way for an economy of higher wages, higher skills and rising productivity. But was it all too good to be true? The Institute for Fiscal Studies has released their analysis and have found that it's middle-income families who are set to be worse off next year amid spiralling costs and tax rises. Carl Emerson is Deputy Director of the IFS and an editor of the annual IFS Green Budget. Carl, it was a very upbeat delivery from Sunak, but you've been quick to point out that there's going to be slow growth in living standards. Is it a culmination of more tax and rising bills? What's at the heart of this?
Combination of three things. It's firstly kind of the terrible productivity performance the UK's had since 2008 is essentially continuing, and the best way to get sustained increases in wages is to get more productivity growth. That's coming on top of, at the moment, rises inflation that listeners will be very aware of, in particular with energy prices going up. And then next April, because Mr. Sunak's chosen to do very, very big tax rise to get the deficit down, but also to fund all of the extra spending he wants to do, that tax rise involves more people paying more income tax and more people paying more in national insurance. So that also weighs down in particular on middle earners. So we think that kind of, the stagnation of earnings growth for middle earners that we've seen since 2008 is going to continue possibly for another few years.
Why would the government consider middle earners to be collateral damage at this time?
I think it's a desire to go on increasing spending on things like health and social care that we want, that are under pressure because of an ageing population, and social care really is in need of more resources and reform. And previous governments have tried really hard to do that while cutting spending elsewhere. So we've seen over many, many years cuts to areas like defence or justice. And I think increasingly governments are finding it hard to find other areas to cut, which means that if you want to increase health spending, if you want to have a better social care system, it means you've got to put taxes up. If you want to put taxes up in a broadly progressive way, it's going to be people on average and above average earnings who are likely to bear the brunt of that.
Rishi Sunak has admitted that he's uncomfortable with the UK's current tax burden, which has risen, I think, to the highest level since the early 1950s, which is the post-war period. How much is it actually going to impact on households?
Well, it certainly is going to be a squeeze that will be experienced over several years to come. I mean, the income tax personal allowance and the point at which you start to pay higher rate tax is set to be frozen for 4 years starting next April. And it's actually more of a time it looked like inflation was going to stay relatively low. Now inflation is turning out to be quite a lot higher. It means that freeze in those thresholds will imply a bigger real cut and will drag more people into income tax and more people into higher rate tax. It actually means that the point at which you start to pay higher rate tax in the UK after inflation will be no higher than what it was back in 1990, which is a remarkable change in how our tax system works.
Yeah, and also the IMS found that trends from the past decade or so, plus the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast, imply essentially no change in average earnings over 20 years. That sounds pretty negative. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, and over the second half of the 20th century, we've got very used to, on average, the economy growing at 2.5% a year after inflation, wages on average growing up in line with that. That growth wasn't always evenly shared, but broadly it meant that living standards were rising. It meant that governments, even if they kept the tax burden constant, could get more money to spend on public services that we all enjoy. The period since 2008 has been very, very different, with productivity growth really stagnating, resulting growth in earnings being very poor, so living standards get squeezed, the government's tax take isn't as strong, and it makes it much harder to get the increases in public spending that we might want in areas such as health. So it's been a kind of remarkable extended period and very, very different to what we were used to over previous decades.
Carl, this wasn't actually a big budget for tax, as the big news of 40 billion of tax rises had already been announced earlier this year. But one of the ones that really did catch our eye was a cut to tax on domestic flights, particularly as this programme is off to broadcast from COP26 next week. And Rishi Sunak removed an anomaly in which people were taxed more to fly in the UK than to Europe. So you could say he's just sort of levelling up. But do you think we need a clearer strategy on taxation for motoring and flying if we're actually going to reach the UK's net zero targets, but also in terms of signalling our good intentions?
So I think the air passenger duty change actually, I think, isn't as bad for the environment as people are saying, and that's because actually domestic travel on domestic flights are captured within the UK's trading scheme. So if we do more flights and we emit more carbon in that way domestically, somewhere else in the UK economy, perhaps manufacturing, perhaps electricity generation, is going to have to do less carbon emitting. But in the broader sense, I definitely agree with you that, the government has a very ambitious target for getting to net zero. What we need is more details of the strategy. How are we going to tax motoring, for example, as more and more cars become electric? The Treasury at the moment collects quite a lot of revenue from fuel duty, from vehicle excise duty. That's going to go away. We need a strategy for replacing that. We need to move closer towards having a uniform carbon tax. So I think there's lots of things we need, and we certainly do need more specifics on how we're going to meet that target.
Were you surprised it wasn't a greener budget in light of COP?
I think I guess surprise is not necessarily the right word. I mean, the freeze in fuel duty is always a bit disappointing. It's the biggest tax we have that is related to the environment. But I can't say I was surprised in the sense that we've now frozen it for, I think, 12 years in a row. So it's almost traditional for the Chancellor to pretend that fuel duty is going to go up in line with inflation. And then you get to the next budget and he says, I'll freeze it for one more year. So I wasn't surprised, but one might have hoped that, particularly with COP coming up, it might have been the moment for, if not an inflation increase in fuel duty, a well thought through strategy for what we're going to do if we are going to let that tax just wither away.
Carl Emerson from the IFS, thank you very much for joining me. Now, I think we've got Catherine Nicholson back on the line, you may recall, if you've been tuned in from the beginning of the programme, and I certainly hope so. Catherine is the Europe editor at France 24 English, and she's reporting to me about the current discordant relations between France and Britain over post-Brexit fishing rights. So, Catherine, give me a sense of what's going on there.
Hi, I hope you can hear me better now. Sorry about that.
Much better, thank you.
Well, as you